Let me begin with a clarification. This talk is not about investigating someone's past. It is not about interrogating people, exposing secrets, or judging whether someone is right or wrong. Instead, this lecture is about something far more subtle. It is about learning to read relationships not through facts, but through language. Because in human relationships, facts are often hidden, incomplete, or intentionally protected. But language, how people describe love, commitment, conflict, and responsibility, reveals something deeper. It reveals the structure of how a person understands relationships. And that structure often tells us more than any direct question ever could. This lecture is particularly for people who stand before a serious decision, especially the decision of marriage. When people consider marriage, they often focus on a person's history. How many relationships did they have? Were they previously married? Did they live with someone before? But those questions rarely reveal the truth we actually need. What matters more is not the record of someone's past relationships, but the framework through which they understand relationships themselves. How do they interpret commitment? How do they process emotional conflict? How do they balance love with responsibility? Those answers do not appear in direct questions. They appear in narrative. The problem with direct questions. Human beings believe that asking direct questions leads to honest answers. But psychologically, the opposite often happens. When a question feels personal or threatening, people naturally become defensive. And once defense appears, truth becomes distorted. People edit their stories. They adjust details. They present themselves in ways they believe are socially acceptable. In other words, the more directly you ask about sensitive subjects, the more carefully constructed the answer becomes. This is why this lecture does not focus on asking questions to obtain answers. Instead, it focuses on asking questions that reveal how people construct their stories. Because people cannot easily fake the structure of their thinking. They may hide facts, but the architecture of their worldview leaks through language. And that is what we observe, reading relationships through narrative. Today we will examine a series of questions, not to extract information, but to observe narrative patterns. In particular, these questions help us understand how someone thinks about relationships. Do they see relationships emotionally or structurally? Do they speak about feelings or about long-term consequences? Do they talk about freedom or responsibility? These patterns reveal something important: the depth of a person's relationship experience. Before we examine the questions themselves, however, we must understand two critical concepts: structure and result. Structure and result. At first, these ideas may sound abstract, but in reality, they are very simple. When people talk about relationships, they usually focus on one of two things. They either talk about structure or they talk about results. Let us begin with structure. Structure refers to the framework that allows a relationship to survive over time. When people who have experienced long-term commitment talk about relationships, they rarely describe them purely as emotional experiences. Instead, they recognize that relationships exist inside a system. That system includes family dynamics, financial responsibility, division of roles, time investment, and methods of resolving conflict. In other words, structure answers questions like these. Is this relationship designed to last? Does it contain mechanisms that allow it to survive conflict? If emotions fade, as they inevitably do, does anything remain that keeps the relationship stable? People who think structurally are not dismissing love. They are simply aware that love alone cannot carry the weight of life. The perspective of results. Now let us consider the second concept: results. Results refer to the real-world consequences that emerge from relationship patterns. When people examine relationships through the lens of results, they ask questions such as, did these relationship patterns actually produce happiness? Did they create stable families? Or did they lead to repeated separation, instability, and emotional damage? For example, someone might say, modern dating is much freer than before, but it also seems like relationships break more easily, and more people end up hurt. This type of statement reflects result-based thinking. It moves beyond the excitement of freedom and asks a deeper question. What did that freedom actually produce? Why structure and results matter. Here is where something fascinating happens. Two people can answer the same question about relationships, but their answers can reveal completely different levels of experience. Consider this simple question. Do you think modern dating has changed compared to the past? One person might answer like this. People are just more free now. Everyone can choose what they want. Another person might answer differently. It seems like dating and marriage have become separated. People date more freely, but fewer relationships turn into long-term commitments. Both answers address the same topic, but they reveal different frameworks. The first answer focuses on freedom and emotional experience. The second answer analyzes structural changes and long-term outcomes. This difference is subtle but psychologically significant. People who have experienced the realities of long-term partnership often develop a shift in perspective. They begin to see relationships not merely as emotional events, but as systems that produce consequences. They start asking questions like, will this relationship still function 5 years from now? What happens when the excitement fades? Can two lives actually integrate? This shift does not mean someone has become cynical. It simply means they have moved from romantic imagination to relational realism. Love versus life. One of the most important distinctions people eventually discover is this. Dating is often driven by emotion. Marriage is sustained by life. Emotion brings people together, but life, shared responsibilities, financial pressure, family obligations, daily habits is what determines whether the relationship survives. This is why people who have experienced long-term commitment often begin to ask a different question when they meet someone. Instead of asking, do I feel excited about this person? They begin asking, can I build a life with this person? Notice the difference. The first question belongs to romance. The second belongs to reality, the philosophy behind this shift. Interestingly, this shift in perspective is not only psychological, it is philosophical. Ancient traditions often warned that human suffering begins when we mistake temporary experiences for permanent realities. Strong emotions feel eternal in the moment, but emotions change. Circumstances change. People change. Experience teaches individuals to recognize this impermanence. And once someone understands that emotions fluctuate, they begin to look for something deeper. They look for structure, shared values, compatibility in daily life, the ability to navigate conflict without destroying the relationship. In other words, they search for foundations. The quiet signals people reveal. This is why listening to how someone talks about relationships can be far more revealing than asking them about their past. When someone describes relationships primarily through emotions freedom, excitement, chemistry, it often indicates a perspective centered on experience. When someone speaks about responsibility, sustainability, and long-term consequences, it often reflects experience shaped by reality. Neither perspective is necessarily wrong, but they belong to different stages of relational understanding. One stage is guided by possibility. The other is guided by consequence. And when people stand at the threshold of marriage, recognizing the difference between those stages becomes critically important. In the next part of this lecture, we will explore how specific questions, seemingly casual questions, can reveal these deeper patterns of thinking, not by forcing people to confess their past, but by allowing their own narratives to quietly reveal how they understand love, commitment, and the architecture of relationships. Because in the end, the most important truths people reveal about themselves are rarely the ones they are directly asked. They are the ones they reveal while simply telling their story. The psychology of modern dating, freedom, possibility, and the hidden structure of choice. At the end of the previous discussion, we arrived at an important insight. When people talk about relationships, they reveal more than their experiences. They reveal the framework through which they interpret love, responsibility, and commitment. Some people speak about relationships through the language of structure and consequences. Others speak through the language of emotion, freedom, and possibility. Neither perspective is inherently right or wrong. They simply reflect different psychological stages in how individuals experience relationships. And this leads us to the next question. If people who have experienced marriage tend to think in terms of structure and consequences, how do people without marriage experience tend to interpret modern relationships? Today, we will explore that question, not by judging their views as correct or incorrect, but by examining the emotional architecture behind those views. Because every belief about relationships is built upon an emotional foundation. And if we understand that foundation, we begin to understand the psychology of modern dating itself. Two axes of modern relationship thinking. To understand how many unmarried people interpret modern dating, it is helpful to think in terms of two psychological axes: emotion and possibility. Emotion refers to how relationships feel in the present moment. Possibility refers to the sense that many future options remain open. Together, these two elements shape how modern relationships are, often perceived by those who have not yet entered long-term commitments like marriage. To explore this idea, let us begin with a simple question. Imagine asking someone, do you think the way people date today is very different from the past? People who have not experienced marriage often respond in ways that sound like the following, and each of these responses reveals a specific emotional orientation. Response 1. Dating feels much freer and more honest now. The first common response is this: dating feels much freer and more honest now. At first glance, this sounds entirely positive, but beneath this statement lies a powerful emotional experience: relief. For many people, modern dating feels liberating compared to older social expectations. In earlier generations, relationships often carried implicit duties. There were expectations about loyalty, endurance, sacrifice, and long-term commitment. Today, many individuals feel those expectations have loosened, and that loosening produces a sense of freedom. People feel less pressure to remain in relationships that no longer feel authentic. They feel more comfortable expressing their true feelings. In this sense, dating becomes less about obligation and more about choice. However, freedom always carries a hidden trade-off. When relationships are defined primarily by freedom, the force that holds them together can weaken. Commitment becomes optional. Endurance becomes negotiable. And relationships may become easier to leave than to repair. This does not mean freedom is harmful. It simply means that freedom shifts the center of gravity in relationships from permanence toward flexibility. Philosophically speaking, many traditions have warned about this subtle dynamic. Human suffering often does not arise from external events alone, but from the mind's attempt either to cling to experiences or to avoid them entirely. Modern dating sometimes reflects the second tendency. Instead of clinging too tightly to relationships, people may become accustomed to leaving before emotional complexity deepens. Response 2. It feels like people have more options now. The second common response sounds like this: it feels like people have more options now. Again, this statement sounds optimistic, but it also contains an important psychological element: security through possibility. When individuals believe that many alternatives exist, they often feel less urgency to commit to one. Instead of moving quickly toward deep emotional investment, they remain in a period of exploration. They compare. They observe. They consider alternatives. This is not necessarily a sign of indecision. It is often a reflection of modern social reality. Dating apps, global mobility, and expanded social networks create the impression that potential partners are almost unlimited. Yet, paradoxically, when options multiply, decisions often become harder. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the paradox of choice. The more options people perceive, the more difficult it becomes to commit fully to one path, because every choice also means letting go of other possibilities. In this way, the feeling of abundant choice can quietly encourage delay, not because people are irresponsible, but because the psychological cost of closing other doors becomes greater. Possibility, in other words, expands freedom, but it can also postpone commitment. Response 3. People respect each other's individual choices. A third response frequently appears. It seems like people respect each other's choices more. This statement reflects another emotional foundation, the desire for recognition and personal autonomy. Many modern relationships emphasize personal boundaries. Partners are encouraged to maintain independence. They avoid interfering too deeply in each other's personal decisions. On the surface, this seems like a healthy development. After all, respect and autonomy are essential for modern relationships. But there is an important distinction hidden beneath this language. For individuals who have not yet experienced the long-term integration of two lives, respect often means non-interference. In other words, I respect your choices may also mean I will not ask you to change. At early stages of relationships, this approach feels harmonious. Conflict is minimized. Personal space is protected. But long-term relationships inevitably require something more difficult. They require adjustment. Two lives must slowly synchronize. Daily habits must adapt. Responsibilities must be negotiated, and differences must be worked through rather than avoided. People who have not yet encountered this reality sometimes interpret conflict simply as incompatibility. If harmony disappears, the relationship may be judged unsuccessful. But in long-term partnerships, conflict is not always a sign of failure. Often it is the beginning of deeper integration. Response 4. Dating doesn't feel like such a heavy responsibility anymore. Another response people often give is surprisingly honest. Dating doesn't feel like such a heavy responsibility anymore. This statement reveals a psychological distance from long-term consequences. For individuals who have not yet experienced marriage, dating typically exists outside the full weight of legal, economic, and familial responsibilities. If a relationship ends, emotional pain may occur, but life itself rarely collapses. Careers continue. Living arrangements remain intact. Family structures are unaffected. Because the structural consequences remain limited, dating can feel like an experience rather than a life-defining commitment. This perspective naturally reduces pressure, but it also changes how people respond to conflict. Instead of asking, how do we solve this problem together? People may simply ask, is this relationship still worth the effort? When relationships are framed primarily as experiences, leaving becomes easier than repairing. Again, this does not mean individuals are careless. It simply reflects the stage of relational experience they inhabit. Response 5. We don't have to follow traditional relationship rules. Finally, there's a statement that appears frequently in modern conversations about dating. We don't really have to follow traditional relationship rules anymore. This statement is often misunderstood as rebellion, but in many cases it reflects something more subtle, a suspension of decision. For individuals who have not yet entered long-term partnership structures, traditional relationship frameworks such as marriage often appear as one option among many. Rather than rejecting those frameworks outright, people simply postpone choosing them. They remain in an open state. Relationships continue as long as they feel meaningful, but they do not necessarily move toward a predetermined endpoint. This open-ended approach reflects a broader cultural shift. Personal autonomy has become a central value of modern identity. People want to feel that they control the direction of their lives. As a result, fixed relationship structures sometimes feel restrictive even when they offer stability. Dating, therefore, becomes less like a road leading toward marriage and more like an open landscape of possibilities. Understanding the psychology without judgment. When we examine these responses together, a pattern emerges. People without marriage experience often interpret relationships through freedom, possibility, personal autonomy, and present emotional comfort. Again, this perspective is not immature or incorrect. It simply reflects a stage in the development of relational awareness. Before individuals experience the deeper integration of lives financially, emotionally, socially, They naturally evaluate relationships through a different lens. Only later do many people begin to incorporate structure, consequence, and long-term stability into their thinking. Understanding this distinction is important because when we listen carefully to how someone describes relationships, we are not just hearing their opinions. We are hearing their stage of experience. And once we understand that stage, we can begin to understand not only how people love, but how they are likely to live.